I noticed a few faces that I don't recognize. I just want to welcome those who are visiting with us today, as well as our present church members and old-timers who are back in the area, like Dave Santos, in for the big day tomorrow. So welcome, everybody. May God bless us all. My church members know that my time here is drawing to a close. This is my next to last Sabbath at the Manor Road Church. I'll be here today and then the beginning of the first week of April. Believe it or not, it turned out that my last month here, I'm on vacation for half of it, and then the other half I'm at conferences. So unfortunately, that's the way it goes. But since we're coming down to the end, I wanted to share some things from the heart, not so much strict biblical exegesis, as I often like to do. I'd like to present some things that I think are important ideas to me, and I hope that they inspire you. Now, I'm not going to talk about the personal stuff. I'll wait for next month when I'm here the last day. Then I can say goodbye and thank you and all of that. Today I want to talk more about a theology of mission. And again, this is something that's important to me as a pastor, and I think I want to try to get that across before I leave. I'm not going to share details of what this church should do, because that's not my right anymore. The next pastor who comes in will have his own plan on what he thinks, what his gifts are and his interests are. But today, as I said, I want to just share a biblical vision, or renew, maybe not so much present as renew a concept of ministry from the Bible. I hope that it will be something that will broaden your horizons and make you feel liberated to get involved in God's work. I'd like to refer to the book of Micah. Micah is one of the known as the minor prophets. It's in the last part of the Old Testament, what we call the Old Testament. So if you go to the book of Matthew and you backtrack a little bit, you'll find the book of Micah. I find that as I was reading this prophetic work during this past year, there were a couple of passages that intrigued me. And the one that we're going to look at, Micah chapter 4, it made me stop and think, because it seemed to present a vision that's a little bit out of the ordinary. It kind of took me by surprise. I think it gives us a different assumption about what the calling of the Christian church, like the people of Israel before us, what it is that God has called us to do. We're in Micah. I give you a lot of time to find it, because I know those minor prophets are all stuck together. Sometimes you got to go back and forth until you find the right one. But hopefully you've reached the book of Micah. We're going to look at chapter 4. And think about it in terms of mission theory. Not necessarily in terms of prophecy. Think of it in terms of what God would have us to do and to be. We're looking at Micah chapter 4. I'm starting with verse 1. It says, "And it will come about in the last days that the mountain of the house of the Lord will be established as the chief of the mountains. It will be raised above the hills, and the peoples will stream to it. Many nations will come and say, 'Come, and let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, and to the house of the God of Jacob, so that he may teach us about his ways, and that we may walk in his path. For from Zion will go forth the law, even the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. And he will judge between many peoples, and render decisions for mighty, distant nations. Then they will hammer their swords into plowshares, and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation will not lift up sword against nation, and never again will they train for war.'" Now, I don't know if you noticed, but in this passage, there's a twist on the way that I think we often conceive of our work as Christians in behalf of God. Notice that in this passage, who is going to who? Is Israel running out trying to, knock on the doors of the surrounding nations and persuade them to accept the law? No. It says clearly that there will come a time when the nations will flock towards the people of God to learn and to be taught. That's the first thing. Do you notice that, or am I just making this up? There's an image here of mission, actually. I think we can call it that, in which the peoples are coming to us, so to speak. That's the first thing. Now notice there's something else in here. It still talks about the nations coming and then going back and having peace among themselves. That tells me that God's image for Israel was not necessarily that everybody was going to be converted to Israel. You notice that? Now I'm stepping out a little bit here because it's not spelled out that way, but if you follow the passage, it seems to suggest two things: that the nations will come to the people of God, they'll receive wisdom and instruction, then they'll go back home and they'll put it into practice in their terms. Now that, if that doesn't stop you in your tracks, then you're not thinking the same way I think. Because often we conceive of our role as having to go out and bring in and make them us. Isn't that true? But I don't see that in this passage. As a matter of fact, if you skip to verse 5, there's an interesting thing here. It says, though all the peoples, that's the nations, walk each in the name of his God. As for us, we will walk in the name of the Lord our God forever. Now, it doesn't say whether that means present or future, but there seems to be the indication that when Israel, the called people of God, have done their job, each of the other nations will continue as they were, but they will be influenced by the people of Israel. And again, I want you to stop right there. And if you take this image that other people will come to the people of God to learn, how does that compare with the way we usually understand our task as Christians? I don't know about you, but I get the distinct impression often that we have a vision in our minds of mission work that goes something like this. We have to kind of go scheme some devise some way, some scheme, some clever device to kind of bridge the gap between us and the people out there. Then once we bridge that gap, we have to sort of like persuade and cajole and somehow, plead, almost as if we're pleading with them to come in. Am I right? Now, I'm not saying that all people at all places have always had this image, but I get the impression that in the back of our minds, sometimes we have this idea that somehow we are an isolated or set-apart group, and our job is somehow to go out and constrain or compel these stubborn, disinterested people to somehow get them to come in. Am I right? Everybody's quiet. Is this not kind of like the image that we often have? But I don't see it here. In Micah, it says the people of God are doing their thing, and everybody else is coming to them. Instead of us going out and pleading with them to come in, they're like pleading for us to let them in. This is a twist. I don't know about you. I don't know if you're quiet because you don't believe me or because it's shocking news to you. I'm not sure what. But to me, as I look at this, again, I'm seeing something completely different than the way we often conceive of our work. Let me make some comparisons. I'm going to suggest that both paradigms, both concepts are true. I'm not saying one is wrong and the other is altogether right. I mean, they both parallel each other. But they do suggest different things. And let me try to put that into an image, okay? It seems to me that often we have a self-image of ourselves as Christians and as our work as if we are like a lifeboat, where the whole world is going to drown, but we have to go out and somehow, like I said, cajole, maybe even persuade, sometimes even compel people to come in to the lifeboat, all right? In the image in the Old Testament that I'm just reading about, the image is different. The image is not of the people of God as a lifeboat as much as it is an image of the people of God as a force for blessing, as a source of blessing that goes out rather than comes in. You following me? All right, and again, as I read this, this has been cooking for a couple of weeks now, so it's not something I just thought about this week. But I remember a couple of weeks ago when I first was noticing this passage, I started to sort of compare it, like I said, to the way we usually think about things. First of all, as I say, we think of ourselves as the lifeboat, and everybody's got to come in. This passage says, no, we're here, and we're sending out the blessings, sending out the blessing of God's teaching, sending out the example of the godly life. That's the first thing. But then I noticed something else. Often, as Seventh-day Adventists in particular, because we're a smaller denomination, we're a smaller group, sect, movement, whatever you want to call us, a lot of times we have the sense that either two extremes. We have either one extreme that we go out into the world feeling insecure about ourselves. I'm saying this is like an underlying assumption. This is not something that's out there on the surface. But a lot of times we feel like, we're the small guys and nobody's going to really want us. And so we have to go out there and sort of, like I say, tries to devise some way to gain acceptance with the people and to overcome the stereotype. So either we go out into the world feeling like insecure and small, or we take the opposite approach where we feel like we have the exclusive rights on God. There's like two extremes. Either we feel insecure about who we are, or we feel so sure that we are the ones that have it right that we go out into the world in sort of a superior sense, looking down at everybody else. And what's worse, sometimes I think we go out into the world as if we have exclusive rights on God. I remember when I was young, and I'm going back in time to my own experience, and let me say this, there's no such thing as theology without biography. Let me say that again. All of our beliefs, people, are rooted in our background and our experience. Whether we emphasize this range of options or the other, ultimately it gets down to what happened to us and what we see. Now, it doesn't mean we're stuck there. We can learn and grow, but ultimately our outlook on life is formed not only by the information, but by the experiences that we pass through. So I think it's valid for me to say, when I was a young man, I was a friend of God. I discovered God when I was 19 years old, but I didn't know it from a church. And I went 2 years like that. I was a friend of God, and I knew it. Then when I met people who were teaching me more about the Bible, more in detail, I didn't realize it at the time, but they made me feel like God wasn't mine anymore. Like God was theirs, and somehow they had the rights to it, and that they had the control over how to open the gate to let God out a little bit to me, because they were the ones who owned it. You follow what I'm talking about? So I'm saying, as Seventh-day Adventists, we kind of waffle between these two approaches. On the one hand, sometimes we feel small because we have this persecution complex. We believe that one day the beast is going to get us, and even though that hasn't happened yet, we act as if it's happening. So we go out feeling small on the one hand, and on the other hand, maybe to boost our own self-image, we go out as if we're the only ones that have it, and we're going to let you have it. Well, I'm here to tell you, people, that as I read the New Testament, God, who in the beginning chose the people of Israel to be His, has in these last days, through Jesus Christ, opened up His selection. He has chosen everybody. So if you have ever felt, I'm here to tell you today, that somehow God is not yours because it belongs to the church or it belongs to somebody who knows the Bible better than you, I'm here to tell you, God is yours. God is yours. Not because I said it, but because that's what Jesus did. And I think instead of going out in a sense of insecurity and with the sense that we have exclusive rights to God, we should do what the apostles did. Go out and proclaim, God is yours. Jesus has broken down the barrier between Israel and the Gentiles, and He has let everybody in. That's what the gospel is. That's why they say they proclaimed it. They preached. That's the word. They went out. They didn't go out to sort of argue and coerce and like sell and withhold. They just went out and say, Jesus Christ has risen from the dead. Jesus Christ has broken down the barriers between God and man. Jesus Christ has broken down the barrier between Israel and the nations. And you were all invited in. Then it was up to them whether they decided to go in or not. But it wasn't up to the apostles to withhold. You follow what I'm talking about? Now, it might sound like I'm getting a little far away from this verse, but I think it's in there. I think it's in there. God has appointed Israel to be a light to the nations, to be a blessing to the nations. Now, again, I'm talking about mission theory, mission theology. Often, we have the idea that ministry is fishing. And Jesus does use that illustration, so it's not wrong. But I think there's another side to it. There's a complementary aspect to it. Some people don't like to fish. Some people don't know how to fish. So there's fishing, that's one metaphor for our job. But the other metaphor that we see here is the idea that we attract. We attract people. How do we do that? Supposing we accept the idea that I'm mentioning here, that we're not about to go out all the time and bring in. Maybe we're just supposed to somehow attract people. Well, how do we do that? I would like to suggest that there's two ways, and they're illustrated here in this verse. One is by living exemplary lives. We're supposed to display the goodness of God so that people will take note. I think that means personally, we have to endeavor to be whole. We have to endeavor to become mature, real people of integrity. Now, I grew up, you know my age, everybody knows I'm middle-aged, most of you are here too, and if you grew up in the USA, as I did, you knew that we grew up in a psychological era. You know, psychology became very popular, about the 60s or something like that, and everybody knew about psychoanalysis, and, you know, you probably knew somebody that was going for counseling, especially if you lived in Manhattan. Everybody kind of that was the thing to do, is to go to counseling. So we grew up knowing about psychological terms. And in psychology, they talk about getting yourself together. Have you heard of that? You know, coming to grips with the things that happened in your childhood, overcoming all the different insecurities and anxieties. We grew up using psychological terms, not so much biblical religious terms, like sin. You know what I mean? We used other terms. But I think that those terms have value. I think this is part of what God calls us to be. Don't you think? Does he want people in his church who are still neurotic, you know, extremist, obsessive, compulsive, hard to get along with, but they happen to know all the right doctrines? Is that the ideal? No, I think there's some value to the idea that God is calling us to get ourselves together, individually and then in our relationships, obviously. Our relationships with one another outside of the church, and I suppose more especially for the witness to the community, how we relate to each other inside the church. So the first thing I'm saying, how is it that we can fulfill this image of Micah? The first thing we do, we ourselves have to become whole. We have to live in such a way that demonstrates the goodness and the glory of God. But it doesn't end there. If we stop there, some of you might be thinking, but Pastor, all that does then is focus us in on ourselves, right? And I know I've been here almost 4 years, not enough time to really get the things done that I would like to have gotten done, really. But I know that there have been people along the way who've said, well, Pastor, when are we going to start kind of like going out into the community? And I've kind of had to slow it down, you know, right from the beginning, from the first 3 months. Until now. It seems like a long time. And so some of you out there might be thinking, how come you're not talking about what we do to go out? Well, there is an aspect of that. If we get ourselves together, thank you, Everett. We have to, at some point, engage the community. You can't just stay inside. But here again, I'm going to suggest a little bit of a different vision of what we do when we go out there. Yes, some people have the gift of evangelism, and I appreciate those, and I give them 100% support. They have the gift to go out there and actually proclaim, but not everybody has that gift. So how about this? How about this, judging from the passage in Micah? How about those of us who may not have the gift of evangelism? How about if we go out into the community just to bless people, just to serve people? How about if we go out with a heart to the world's needs, a heart to the needs of our next door neighbor and of our communities, and we go out and we're saying, okay, maybe I'm not going to preach today, but I'm going to get to know people. I'm going to engage them. I'm going to join what they're doing. I'm going to contribute to the well-being of my society. Now, I didn't make up this idea. Two places I've worked in my life, they had this concept, and I've learned it from them. When I was in college, I was part of an outdoor ministry. I think I've mentioned it to you once or twice before, called Recreation Unlimited. Doesn't that sound good? The theory of this ministry was to go into national parks and campgrounds in the western United States, and we would go and put on programs for the campers. Apparently, the pastor who had the idea for this program conceived the idea after the state of California cut its budget. And they used to have a lot of like ranger talks and, programs and films, and then when they came down to hard times in the state, they cut out all those extraneous things. And that's when the pastor said, hey, why don't we get some of our volunteers and we'll go out and do it. We'll go out and we'll serve the community. We'll meet the community's needs there. We're not going to necessarily preach to everybody. As a matter of fact, most of the people who come to our programs won't even know we're Christians necessarily. But we're going to go there, we're going to serve the community, and in the process, they're going to get to know us. And maybe one or two here and there each week. You have crowds that come, but maybe one or two you meet. Maybe it's that family that you take on the boat water skiing. That was my job, by the way, for the summer. I drove a water ski boat on Lake Shasta, in case anybody's ever been out there. That's all we did. We were out there with the people. But when you're out on the boat and you've been with them and they've been skiing for 3 hours and now you're all relaxing under the sun, floating on the water, eating your sandwiches, they ask you, well, what makes you guys tick? We go out and serve the community and engage the community. We build bridges. We establish rapport. They know who we are. We go out to bless. Not everybody can go out to evangelize cold, but I think all of us can get involved in something and meet people. And if we have the confidence to know that the church is behind us, if we have the confidence to know that God has given us the commission to go out and announce the good news, we can do that with a clear conscience without feeling forced. We can be like this. We can have exemplary lives in the community, and we can go out and engage the community. So what I'm saying is this. In the Bible, we have both images of mission, and sometimes they've been called by two words. The traditional concept of ministry, where we go out and make disciples and bring them in, that's called viewing the church as a field. In other words, it's a field into which you bring people and plant them to grow. That's one metaphor. That's a biblical metaphor. It's useful, but it's not the only one, and that's what I'm here to say today. Sometimes we feel our options are limited because our understanding of what we're called to do is too narrow. Field, that's one metaphor, but there's another metaphor called force. The church as a force. Not as something that we're called to bring somebody into us, but the church is a force that radiates out and influences the community. There's a well-known passage, and I have to read this because I know that some of you probably have it in your mind. The book Ministry of Healing is one of the more influential writings that formed our mission concept in Seventh-day Adventist thinking. And lately, almost every time I've gone to a seminar or we've had a guest speaker even come in here to talk about ministry, almost invariably they quote Ministry of Healing page. Does anybody remember the page number? 143. Ministry of Healing page 143. I'm going to read this because I know you're familiar with it, but I want to ask you some questions to see if you really got the message. This is what it says. It says, Christ's method alone will give true success in reaching the people. And people like that because it shows us, do we want to have true success? Then there's only one way to do it, and we got to use the method that Jesus used. So what did he do? It says, the Savior mingled with people as one who desired their good. Do you hear that? He went out. He went to where the people were. And did he go out there with an ulterior motive? He went there to desire their good, to see how he could bless. It says, he showed sympathy for them. He ministered to their needs, and he won their confidence. Then he said, follow me. Now, this is very interesting. You know what it says? It says he went out, he mingled with people with the attitude to bless. He sympathized for their pains. He didn't condemn. He didn't look down on them. He sympathized for their real life struggles. He helped them as he could. And in so doing, he gained their trust. Then, after all of that, he said, now come and do what I'm doing. Come and follow me. When I went to a presentation last summer, I drove my wife and one of the members of the other church to a community services event up in Connecticut. And since I was there, I drove there, I sat in on the first lecture and the last lecture when I went back to pick them up at the end of the weekend. And the fellow used that verse, and he said, most of us church members hear that paragraph, and what they want to do is jump to the end. They want to get as fast as possible to the part where we're saying, follow me. They don't want to go through long-term process of establishing trust in relationships. They want to just kind of, okay, we'll do it. Let's go out and hang out with the people for a little while, and then after a week, ask them to join the church. That's still the concept in many people's minds. And obviously, he debunked that concept. He says, no, you can't do that. Jesus may have been able to do it in a day. You know, he was the rabbi. He was a Jew among his own countrymen. He had the power to heal. He could do it in a day, but we can't do it like that. We have to take time to get to know people, to hear their hurts, to desire their good, to establish trust, and then we ask them to follow me. But there's still another twist to this story. When Jesus said, follow me, what did he mean? When we go out and we establish trust and meet people's needs and then say, follow me, what is it in your mind that we're asking them to do? Is it that we're asking them to join the church? Is it that we're asking them to come into the field? Or is it that we're asking them to do what we're doing, going out as a force and healing people? Are you following me? You know, there's another concept out there. That's my point today. There is another concept out there than the one we're used to. And the only reason I'm bringing that out is because I think when we only have the one, then it limits 75% of us from getting involved in the mission of God. Now, I didn't have time to get there yet. I'm only here 3 years, 8 months, something like that. You know, I was hoping to establish things little by little until we started from the center, and then we got out there. But I wanted to leave this image in your mind. The church as a force, not necessarily as a field. The church as a community of blessing, not necessarily a community of, you know, going out to capture people and bring them in. You know what I'm saying? While I was sitting at my desk one morning, kind of writing this out, like I said, about 2 weeks ago, a friend of mine called who's a Jewish Seventh-day Adventist. He's very involved in the church work. He works as a Religious Liberty Director for the Pacific Union Conference. And I don't know how it came up, but we talked about this, and I said, you know, there's an image in Micah that seems to suggest that our job is not necessarily, notice I said not necessarily, I'm not saying certainly. I said there's an image in Micah that seems to suggest that our job is not necessarily to convert everybody as much as to go out there and bless and to heal the world. That's what it says here. That's what Micah is saying. His people are called to live in such a way that the world gets put back together again. And when I said that to him, he said, you know, that's a Jewish expression. He says, in Hebrew language, we have a word, 2 words, tikkun olam, which means heal the world. The people of God are called not to twist arms, not to, manipulate, not to compel people. We're here to live a life of healing. So that, listen to people, instead of us begging them to come in, they say, we see what you're doing. Can we do it too? Imagine that. Imagine that. That's why I entitled my sermon, Imagine. Imagine yourself knowing without a shadow of a doubt that God has accepted you, that God is yours. Imagine. Imagine in your walk with God, He's teaching you so that you yourself are becoming a whole integrated person. So that when you interact with your family or with your co-workers or with your enemies, you can do it clear and right. You may not solve all your problems, but at least you know you're doing it right. Imagine. Imagine your relationships within the church at peace and love, exemplifying what God has called us to, and I'm almost done. Imagine the church. Imagine the Manor Road Church. Maybe it's still going to take a while. I'm not saying it's got to happen overnight. Imagine the Manor Road Church all of a sudden reaching out now infiltrating the community, not necessarily always in the traditional ways, but reaching out so that we have contact and people know what we're here, why we're here, and what we're doing. Imagine. I'm jumping to the end now because I guess I've made my point already. But I want you to imagine the church bringing God's love to people in such a way that they come to us and say, hey, we want to get in. Imagine that. Now, to quote somebody well known, you may say, I'm a dreamer, but I'm not the only one. You know who said it? Jesus said, therefore, let your light so shine before men that they will see. How does it go again? I better read it. All right, you guys know it better than I do. I never was good at memorizing. It says, let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works and glorify your Father who is in heaven. Amen.